The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical by Shane Claiborne, Chapter 7, Pledging Allegiance When Kingdoms Collide. I have become well acquainted with the dualism in North American church. Once, after taking a trip to Iraq to protest war, I went to Willow Creek and gave a talk titled The Scandal of Grace. Afterward, they explained to me that the pulpits are not for political messages. I thought about what would have happened if Reverend King hadn't allowed the gospel to get political. My heart sank as I walked into the foyer and noticed something I'd never seen before, the American flag standing prominently in front of the auditorium. And never before was I so heartbroken that the cross was missing. For the flag and the cross are both spiritual, and they are both political. It is a dangerous day when we can take the cross out of the church more easily than the flag. No wonder it is hard for seekers to find God nowadays. It's difficult to know where Christianity ends and the America begins. Our money says, "In God we trust." God's name is on American money, and American's flag is on God's altars. Politics, schmolitics. For those of us who have grown instantly nauseated at the mention of the word politics, maybe we can break it down a little bit. The English word for politics derives from the Greek word polos, as in metropolis or Indianapolis. The word is rooted in the concepts of city, civil, citizen, civic, basically what it means to be a society of people. Anything involving humans living together purposefully is political, a polis. As the people of God, we are building a new society in the shell of the old, a new polis, the new Jerusalem, the city of God. This is essentially a political act. Without a doubt, envisioning the radical counterculture values of God's kingdom is, by its essence, political. Imagine the Gospels with every mention of king, kingdom, Lord, Savior, crowns, banners, and thrones. All words from the imperial lexicon, all edited out. A gospel that is not political is no gospel at all. The root of the word allegiance means Lord. That's exactly what the early Christians were executed for pledging allegiance to another kingdom, another Lord, treason. In 2004, as the presidential election rolled out, many of us studied the scriptures and considered what it means to claim Jesus as Lord or as president. When people asked who I was voting for, I would say, my president has already ascended the throne and has already delivered the State of the Union address. I don't believe that God needs a commander-in-chief or a millionaire in Washington, and I have little faith that either of the likely option will incarnate the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and the fruit of the Spirit. I will declare my allegiance from the mountaintops, joining the chorus of the saints and martyrs, and I will raise the banner of love above all flags. Above all, we vote every day by how we live, what we buy, and who we pledge allegiance to. So I just resolved to write in my vote, as I did not find it in the national ballot, and I was determined not to let my vote be confined to a private booth, secret ballot, or taboo conversation. Pulling out of Babylon. Besides politics, there are other words that sometimes give folks trouble. Christian jargon includes words like faith, faithful, and faithfulness that are not easy to wrap your hands around. These are complex words, especially for folks outside of Christendom. If you look up faith in the dictionary, most of the definitions revolve around complete trust, unquestioned loyalty, confident allegiance. Though it may be a little bit of a stretch for those of us with entrenched Christian minds, let's try thinking of faith as loyalty as a faithful husband. What are we loyal to? Many are loyal to political parties, and most folks are faithful to their friends. Patriots are faithful to their countries. What are Christians loyal to? Faith in the Roman Empire was a central virtue for the first century Mediterraneans. The Greek word for faith, pistis, was used to describe loyalty to Caesar. People had faith in Caesar, and Reciprocally, Caesar was faithful to preserve peace and prosperity. People were killed for being faithless. It was precisely his faithlessness to Rome and his faithfulness to Jesus for which John, the writer of Revelation, was persecuted and exiled by Emperor Domitian. It's not surprising that the early Christians were labeled by imperial officials as the faithless. Over and over, early Christian writings tell us of how Christians were branded atheists by the imperial courts and executed for the capital crime. They had lost all faith in the empire and had become faithful to God alone as the one who could preserve peace and prosperity. They claimed Jesus as their only emperor, Acts 17:7, and they preached the kingdom of their God, and they pledged allegiance to the slaughter of the Lamb. Today, there are many things I love about America the Beautiful, and yet the book of Revelation sounds a clear warning that any glory we give to Babylon is glory that belongs only to God. As my friend Tony Campolo says, we may live in the best Babylon in the world, but it is still Babylon, and we are called to come out of her. John warns the church in Asia Minor to be faithful unto death, Revelations 2 verse 10. He describes a marriage between God and God's people. They are to be loyal to their lover, Yahweh, their faith remaining in God alone, adorned as a bride, the New Jerusalem, describing Rome as a whoring seductress, Babylon the Great. John warns the Christians that the empire will entice them with a counterfeit splendor, and he warns against flirting with her pleasures and treasures, which will soon come to ruin. They are not to be shocked and awed by Babylon's power, nor dazzled by her jewels. Rather than drinking humanity's blood from her golden cup of suffering, 17 verse 6. They are to choose the Eucharist cup filled with the blood of the new covenant. We are faithful not to the triumphant golden eagle, ironically, also an imperial symbol of power in Rome, but to the slaughtered lamb. When kingdoms collide. Shortly after September 11th, I traveled to speak to a large congregation in the Midwest. And no, it wasn't Willow Creek. Before I got up to preach, a military color guard presented the U.S. flag at the altar. The choir filed in one by one, dressed in red, white, and blue, with the battle hymn of the Republic playing in the background. I knew I was in big trouble. The congregation pledged allegiance to the flag, and I wished it were all a dream. It wasn't. I got up to speak, thankful I was standing behind a large podium, lest anyone tried to pelt me with a pew Bible. I went forward to preach the truth in love, with my knees knocking, and managed to make it out okay, with a bunch of hugs and a few feisty letters. This is dramatic, though painfully true, illustration of the messy collision of Christianity and patriotism that has ripped across our land. I saw a banner hanging next to the City Hall in downtown Philadelphia that read, "Kill them all and let God sort them out." A bumper sticker read, "God will judge evildoers. We just have to get them to him." I saw a t-shirt on a soldier that said, U.S. Air Force, we don't die. We just go to hell to regroup. Others were less dramatic, red, white, and blue billboards saying, God bless our troops, God bless America, became a marketing strategy. One store hung an ad in their window that said, God bless America, $1 burgers. Patriotism was everywhere, including in our altars and church buildings. In the aftermath of September 11th, most Christian bookstores had a section with books on the event, calendars, devotionals, buttons, all decorated in the colors of America, draped in stars, stripes, and sprinkled with golden eagles. The burst of nationalism reveals the deep longing we all have for a community, a natural thirst for intimacy that liberals and progressive Christians would have done much better to acknowledge. September 11th shattered the self-sufficient, autonomous individual, and we saw a country of broken, fragile people who longed for community. For people to cry with, be angry with, to suffer with. People did not want to be alone in their sorrow, rage, and fear. But what happened after September 11th broke my heart. The conservative Christians railed around the drums of war. Liberal Christians took to the streets. The cross was smothered by the flag and trampled under the feet of angry protesters. The church community was lost. So the many hungry seekers found community in the civic religion of American patriotism. People were hurting and crying out for healing, for salvation in the best sense of the word, as in the salve with which you dress a wound. A people longing for a savior placed their faith in the fragile hands of human logic and military strength, which have always let us down. They have always fallen short of the glory of God. Non-traditional family values. Feeling desperate in the aftermath of September 11th, I asked Stephen, one of the kids in my neighborhood, what we should do. Stephen has grown up in the inner city and has seen some of the hardest things and is well acquainted with violence. He is about 13 now, and he has always been one of my teachers. When he was 8, he told me that he had been trying to figure out who invented the gun. One day, he ran up and said, Hey, I figured it out. I know who invented the gun. Who? I asked. Satan, because Satan wants us to destroy each other, and God wants us to love each other. So when I asked him 2 days after September 11th, when he was 10, what should we do? He thought penitently and said, Well, those people did something very evil. I nodded. He went on, But I always say, he was 10 years old. 2 wrongs don't make a right. It doesn't make sense for us to hurt them back. Besides, we are all one big family. Then his face brightened, and he looked around at me wide-eyed and said, Shane, that means you and me are brothers. We laughed, and I thought to myself, Stephen, tell that to the world. Jesus offers a new vision of family. Jesus tells a guy named Nicodemus that in order to enter the kingdom of God, he has to be reborn. John 3, 1-8. At one point in the Gospels, someone tells Jesus that his biological mother and brothers are outside. And Jesus says, Who are my mothers and brothers? Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Mark 3, 31-35. He had a new definition of family rooted in the idea that we are adopted as orphans into a family of God, and that this rebirth creates a new kinship that runs deeper than biology or geography or nationality. Rebirth is about being adopted into a new family without borders. With new eyes, we can see that our family is both local and global, including but transcending biology, tribe, or nationality. A renewed vision of kingdom of God with brothers and sisters in Afghanistan and Iraq, Sudan and Burma, North Philly and Beverly Hills. Any short of that is too myopic for a Jesus whose own biological family called him crazy for saying things that disrupted traditional family values. There is a passage where Jesus says that unless you hate your own family, you are not ready to be his disciple. Luke 14:26. That was one of my favorite verses in high school. Some folks tried to explain it away by saying that Jesus meant that our love for our family should look dismal compared to our love for God, and that there is some truth in that. But particularly in Luke's gospel, the words used is hate. Just like when Jesus talks about hating enemies, it is true that Jesus is not shunning a love for our families. He loves his mama so much that when he was dying on the cross, he tells John that now she is his mama. Again, the new sense of kinship, as they were not biologically related. It is also clear that Jesus is using some strong language to stretch our vision of family and kingship, extending rather than stifling our love. Perhaps the most infinite love we can experience is that of a mama for her little baby, or of a husband for his wife. And Jesus is saying that the same love must be extended in our rebirth. The same desperate love a mother has for her baby, or that a child has for her daddy, is extended to all of our human family. Biological family is too small of a vision. Patriotism is far too myopic. A love for our own relatives and a love for the people of our own country, are not bad things, but our love does not stop at the border. We now have a family that is much broader than biology, that runs much deeper than nationalism. Jesus is telling us that we have a family in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine. We have family members who are starving and homeless, or dying of AIDS, or in the midst of war. The reality of our rebirth should mess with us. There are times when it does, as in the deep groaning that swept our nation after the tsunami in 2004. People waited in line to adopt children orphaned by the disaster, and a sense of solidarity and family extended across the planet. Or consider the hundreds of families who opened their homes to those suffering from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. People across the country made tremendous sacrifices in order to bring their displaced neighbors into their families, knowing the burden was too big to bear alone. And it got a little lighter as more and more people decided to carry it together. But back in Jesus' age, just as in our own, family is one of the most significant barriers to a potential risk taker who would leave everything for the way of the cross. This might explain why Jesus has some hard things to say about our earthly ties, such as not burying our dead or leaving behind our mothers and fathers and all that is born of the flesh. These earthly allegiances create a myopia that stands in the way of God's vision and justice, which are larger than tribe, clan, or nation. Violence is always rooted in a myopic sense of community, whether it be nationalism or gangs. We long for people to fight with, mourn with, and celebrate with. In my neighborhood, kids talk about their fam, referring to the people in their cliques whom they would go to great distances to protect. Graffiti murals and veteran walls help us to remember people in our tribes who have died. Martin Luther King sensed the myopia both in the ghettos and in the Vietnam War, and longed for a vision to be broader than our fam or our country. As King said, we are bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for all-embracing and unconditional love for all. The tragedy of the church's reaction to September 11th is not that we railed around families in New York and D.C., but that our love simply reflected the borders and allegiances of the world. We mourned the deaths of each soldier, as we should, but we did not feel the same anger and pain for Iraq's death, or for the folks abused in the Abu Ghraib prison incident. We got farther and farther from Jesus' vision, which extends beyond our rational love and the boundaries we have established. There is no doubt that we must mourn those lives lost on September 11th. We must mourn the lives of the soldiers, but with the same passion and outrage, we must mourn the lives of every Iraqi who is lost. They are just as precious, no more, no less. In our rebirth, every life lost in Iraq is just as tragic as the life lost in New York City. And the lives of 30,000 children who die of starvation each day is like September 11th every single day, a silent tsunami that happens every week. To Iraq. I began to hear other voices echoing my friend Stephen's. We met a man named Bob McIvan, his 26-year-old son. Bobby was killed in September 11th attacks. I have spoken alongside Bob at several places, at several peace vigils and demonstrations, and he has become a good friend of our community. When he speaks, he wears Bobby's baseball cap and always has tears in his eyes. He shares his pain and anger at the loss of his son. And then he says, one second. Whew. But there has not been a moment that passed when I believed that more violence will solve anything. I do not want any father to feel what I feel right now. He has a strong sense that the people of Iraq are dads, families, and children. He and others who lost family members started a group called the Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, whose slogan has become, "Our grief is not a cry for war." Several of them have gone to Iraq to be with families there. They share the stories of ordinary Iraq people who would flood them with hugs and flowers and gifts to bring back to families who lost their loved ones in September 11th attacks. These are the stories that should have been made the news. Stories that were drowned out by the noise of war. Heavy on my heart during this time were the children in our neighborhood who we are trying to teach not to hit each other. I felt the ethos of violence in our neighborhood, and I have seen the bitter fruit of the myth of redemptive violence. I heard a kid declare war on another kid, calling him a terrorist. I think I just got tired of people hurting each other. In my neighborhood and in our world, the words of Reverend Martin Luther King echoed in my spirit as he continually taught rejected, angry urban youth that violence and weapons would not solve their problems. He came to realize that they were receiving contradictory messages. I had told them that the Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems, but they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems. The questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly in the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. Every time our government chooses to use military force to bring about change in the world, it once again teaches our children the myth of redemptive violence, the myth that violence can be an instrument for good. This is precisely the logic we are trying to get rid of ourselves, especially here in the inner city, and even more so for those who have pledged allegiance to the cross rather than the sword, and heed Jesus' rebuke to Peter that all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Matthew 26:52. Violence infects us. We begin to believe that violence can bring peace in our world, in our neighborhoods, in our homes, in our hearts. I think of the memorial garden a few blocks from my house, near the inner city school with the most graduates who died in Vietnam. It's no coincidence that it is one of the poorest neighborhoods in our city. There are plenty of times I'd like to bust out a sword and cut someone's ear off like Peter, but I begin to consider what it means to pledge allegiance to Jesus and his cross. After nearly a year of discernment, seeking the wisdom of God and close friends, I decided to join the chorus of peacemakers, the incredible witness of voices in the wilderness, and the Christian peacemaker teams and peaceful tomorrows. After counting the cost of going to Iraq and the cost of not going to Iraq, I went to Baghdad in March 2003 with the Iraq Peace Team, a team of clergy, priests, veterans, doctors, journalists, students, and concerned citizens. I put together a statement articulating why I was going, and I headed to Iraq, where I ended up living through the most beautiful and horrific month of my life. I was there during the bombing of Baghdad, visiting homes, hospitals, and families, and going to worship services with hundreds of Iraqi Christians I met there. Essentially, I went to Iraq because I believe in a God of a scandalous grace. I have pledged allegiance to a king who loved evildoers so much he died for them, teaching us that there is something worth dying for, but not worth killing for. I went to Iraq in the footsteps of an executed and risen God. The Jesus of margins suffered an imperial execution by an oppressive regime of wealthy and pious elites. And now he dares me and woos me to come and follow, to take up my cross, to lose my life, to find it, with the promise that life is more powerful than death, and that it is more courageous to love our enemies than to kill them. I went to Iraq to stop terrorism. There are extremists, both Muslim and Christians, who kill in the name of their gods. Their leaders are millionaires who live in comfort, while their citizens die neglected in the streets. But I believe in another kingdom that belongs to the poor and to the peacemakers. I went to Iraq to stand in way of war. Thousands of soldiers have gone to Iraq willing to kill people they do not know because of political allegiance. I went willing to die for people I do not know because of a spiritual allegiance. I went to Iraq as a missionary in the age of an omniscient, omnipresent war. It is my hope that Christian peacemaking becomes the new face of global missions. May we stand by those who face the impending wrath of the empire and whisper, God loves you, I love you, and if my country bombs your country, I will be right here with you. Otherwise, our gospel has little integrity. As one of the saints said, if they come for the innocent and do not pass over our bodies, then cursed be our religion. I went to Iraq hoping to interrupt terrorism and war, in small ways and in large ways. In moments of crisis and in everyday rhythms, I went to Iraq as an extremist for love. Family in Iraq. Looking back now, I am embarrassed at how surprised I was to find friends and family in Baghdad. It was as if I thought Iraq was filled with Osama bin Ladens and Saddam Husseins, and not with families and children just like our own. I grew especially close to one of the shoeshine boys, a homeless boy about 10 years old named Masif, who shined shoes to survive. The first day I met him, he was begging me for money to buy something to eat. I had been forewarned not to get in habit of giving money to boys who lined the streets in front of our apartments. When I stubbornly said no to his relentless attempts on my wallet, he turned away and muttered a string of obscenities. I whipped my head around in shock, and he took off running. Not the best first impression. Day after day, though, we grew on each other. We went for walks, turned somersaults, and yelled at airplanes. Saddam! Peace! Every day when I walked outside... Salam! Peace. Every day when I walked outside, he would run at me full speed, jump into my arms, and kiss me on the cheek. And I had the shiniest shoes in Baghdad. One day, Massouf joined our group on a walk into the center of town carrying pictures of Iraqi children and families suffering from war and sanctions. Journalists took pictures and talked to us as we stood in one of Baghdad's busiest intersections. Massouf had begun to internalize what was happening. His shining face became bleak. Nothing I could do made him smile. As the group went home and the cameras left, Musif and I continued to sit. He mimicked with his hand the falling of bombs and made the sound of explosions. As tears welled up in my eyes, suddenly he turned and latched onto my neck. He began to weep. His body shook as he grasped for each breath of air. I began to cry. I was glad the cameras were gone as we wept as friends, as brothers, not as peacemakers, and a victim. Afterward, I took him to eat, banquet style, tipping everyone extravagantly so my guests would be welcomed. Every 5 minutes, he would ask me, "Are you okay?" I would nod and ask, "Are you okay?" And he would nod. In Iraq, we were considered guests and received such warm hospitality. Meals that were on the house, free rides from taxi drivers. In their minds, ordinary people separated us from our government. The Iraq people were incredibly strong. In the midst of the bombing, they still had weddings, music festivals, and soccer matches in the street. One day, we had a birthday party for a young girl named Amal, who was turning 13. We had a feast, grilling out in a park nearby. We played all kinds of crazy games, blew bubbles, juggled, turned flips, and ran in circles until we couldn't stand up anymore. As we played a little game of balloon volleyball, bombs began to explode in the background. The adults all looked uneasily at each other, but we kept playing. Then one of the explosions hit very close. A couple of us huddled down with the little children. I looked at this young teenager who had the courage I could only dream of. She looked deep into my timid eyes and said, "It's okay, don't be scared." And she smacked me on the head with a balloon. These children are raised hearing bombs in 1998 and 1991, and yet they will still play in the park with people whose country is destroying theirs. Amal joked about how she might think differently about the war if Bush would bomb her school. When we asked her what she wanted for her birthday, she said, peace. And it wasn't because we told her to. She really believed that someday people might not kill each other. As bombs continued to thunder in the background, I was reminded once again that life is more powerful than death, that children can teach old tyrants and cynics how to love. I was reminded of the verses in Isaiah that prophesied the coming of the reconciled creation and people, where the wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat, and the calf and the lion and the yearling together. The last words in the verse are, and a little child will lead them, Isaiah 11:6. I was invited to worship services nearly every day while in Iraq. The Christians in Baghdad gave me so much hope for the church. One of the most powerful worship services I had ever experienced was just a few days before I headed home. Hundreds and hundreds of Christians from all over Middle East had gotten together, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox. They read a statement from the Christian church directed to the Muslim community, declaring that they love them and that they believe they were created in the image of God. Then we sang familiar songs like Amazing Grace. We said the Lord's Prayer in several languages. They led us to the cross and prayed a prayer similar to the one that Jesus prayed when he was on the cross. Forgive us, for we know not what we are doing. Hundreds and hundreds of people continued to try to get into service and ended up gathering outside with candles. It was holy. Afterward, I was able to meet one of the bishops who had organized the gathering, and I explained to him that I was shocked to find so many Christians in Iraq. He looked at me puzzled and then gently said, "Yes, my friend, this is where it all began. This is the land of your ancestors. That is the Tigris River and the Euphrates. Have you read about them?" I was floored by my ignorance and by the ancient roots of my faith. In the land of my ancestors, Christianity was not invented in America. How about that? The bishop went on to tell me that the church in the Middle East was deeply concerned about the church in the United States. He said, "Many Americans are for this war." I nodded. And he asked, "But what are the Christians saying?" My heart sank. I tried to explain to him that many of the Christians in the U.S. are confused and hope that this is a way that God could liberate the Iraqi people. He shook his head and said very humbly, "But we Christians do not believe that. We believe blessed are the peacemakers. We believe if you pick up the sword, you die by the sword. We believe in the cross." Tears welled up in my eyes as he said, "We will be praying for you. We will be praying for the church in the U.S. to be the church." Road of Angels. I left Baghdad with other members of a peace team in a 3-car convoy, heading for Jordan, through the Western Iraq desert. Bridges were down, debris covered the streets, and destroyed vehicles were strewn along the road. A few hours in the trip, we began looking for gas. Our gas station was bombed, another abandoned, then another. With tanks on empty, we stopped at a final gas station, also vacant. We were joined by a van filled with students from the University of Baghdad who were headed for refugee camps in Jordan. Before long, they had hooked the battery of their van up to the gas pump, and using the energy from the battery, they filled our car with gas, and we headed off with renewed vigor. The roads became increasingly treacherous. There were bombed out buses and incinerated ambulances. We swerved out of the way of light posts, car parts, and shrapnel. Soon we could see the gigantic smoke clouds from bomb hits, only seconds old, on the near horizon. One of the bombs hit only about a kilometer away. The drivers became increasingly tense, speeding up to about 80 miles per hour to minimize the likelihood of becoming collateral damage in this war. We began to lose sight of each other, and suddenly one of the tires on our car, the last in the convoy, burst with a loud pop, and we spun out of control. The car plunged into a ditch and flipped onto its side. We were able to climb out of the doors on the top of the side of the car and pull everyone out. The 5 of us were all injured and badly shaken, and 2 had life-threatening injuries. One person was bleeding profusely from his head. The first thing I noticed was a car of Iraqi citizens that had stooped to help us. It was the first car to pass, and within 1 minute of the accident, without a second thought, they piled all of us into their car and headed to the nearest town. Waving a white sheet out the window as the warplanes continued to fly overhead, miraculously, only minutes away, there was a little town called Raqqa, a city of about 20,000 people located about 150 kilometers east of the Jordan border. As they drove us to the hospital, many thoughts went through my mind, including the worry that we would become hostages. So I handed them a sheet that explained in Arabic who were, and they nodded with smiles. As we drove into the town, we were deeply disturbed to see that it was devastated by bombing. Before we could get out of the car, doctors greeted us, and the town began to gather. When they learned that several of us from the U.S., the head of the doctor asked loudly, "Why this? Why? Why is your government doing this?" We had frequently asked this question ourselves. With tears in our eyes, he explained that only a couple of days earlier, one of the bombs had hit the hospital, the children's ward, so they could not take us to the hospital. He added with a dignified smile, "But you are our brothers, and we will take care of you. We take care of everyone, Christian, Muslim, Iraqi, American. It doesn't matter. We are all human beings. We are all sisters and brothers." And they set up a little clinic with 4 beds and saved my friend's life, apologizing for the scarcity of supplies due to the sanctions. The townspeople began to bring blankets and water. When we inquired about going back to the car to get our passports and bags, they looked at us like we were crazy, explaining that even their ambulances had been hit by the bombs, but they smiled and invited us to live in Raqqa. By that time, the other cars in our convoy had returned and found us, having been told by the van of university students that the car had crashed. And we had a lovely reunion. After passing the car, they weren't sure we were still alive. We finished the tremendous journey through the war zone, stopping briefly by the car to get our belongings and heading for the border. As we left, the townspeople and doctors gave us hugs, kissed us, and placed their hands on their hearts. We offered the doctors money, but they insisted that they were caring for us as a family. They did have one request: tell the world about Raqqa, and we have. My close friend Jonathan and Leah Wilson Hartgrove, who were in the convoy with me, started a community just a few weeks after returning from Iraq. The community is called Raqqa House, and they do their best to practice the hospitality that we received in that little town. The story is a testimony to the tremendous courage and generosity of the Iraqi people. It exemplifies our time in Baghdad, and all its beauty and in all its horror. When the people of Raqqa put their hands over their hearts as a sign of respect, it struck me how similar it looked to saluting the flag to pledge allegiance. It was as if they touched their hearts to pledge to love and care for us, a beautiful sign of an allegiance that runs deeper than family and biology, an allegiance whose only banner is love. It was refreshing to find family in Iraq and to bring the stories of those brothers and sisters back home. It was also refreshing to bring the Iraqi people the stories of hundreds and hundreds of creative and prophetic actions for peace being taken in the United States. People back home began to vigil, lobby, and cry out in the streets and in the federal buildings. Over 100 people were arrested for blocking the doors of a federal building in Philadelphia. They had gathered not in polarizing anger of street protest, but in the quiet revolutionary subordination that influential Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder speaks of. Revolutionary subordination exposes the evils of power and violence without mirroring them, by gently allowing them to destroy themselves and then rising above the ruins. This approach, of course, is exemplified by Jesus, who was led like a lamb to the slaughter. It was with revolutionary subordination that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross, Colossians 2 verse 15. His was a humble, redemptive suffering that flew in the face of the arrogant myth of redemptive violence. The protesters in Philly were not pointing fingers and thanking God that they were not like the evildoers. They were simply beating their chests and saying, "God, have mercy on us sinners, for the mess we have made of your world." In fact, many of them duct taped their mouths shut to symbolize the silent voices. I remember hearing about it when I was in Iraq. Alexa, the first little child to live out in our community at the simple way, held a sign reading, "Toddlers for Peace." And I remember seeing a picture of my community partner, Michelle, with a button that said, "I have a family in Iraq." I knew she was thinking about me, and I knew she was thinking much more broadly about the Iraqi children and the US soldiers, a family suffering far too much because we know not what we do, as a wise man once perceived. There was a beautiful moment right after I returned from Iraq when the kids in the ghetto cried out against the violence on our streets and in our world. The kids on my block had decorated the streets with sidewalk chalk and a slogan that read, "No war forever." Once again, the grass pierces concrete, love overcomes hatred, and non-violence breaks through the ghetto streets. We were learning the way of the Prince of Peace, and we were teaching the way to our kids. One of the things that became painfully clear to me in Iraq is that what's at stake today is the reputation not just of America, but of Christianity, and that's what keeps me up all night. I heard people in Iraq call leaders in the US Christian extremists, just as leaders here speak of Muslim extremists. Everyone is declaring war and asking for God's blessing. One beautiful Iraqi mother threw her hands in the air and said, "Your country is declaring war in the name of God and asking God's blessing. And that is the same thing my country is doing. What kind of God is this? What has happened to the God of love, to the Prince of Peace?" Her question haunts me. A woman in the US came up to me after I had spoken about my time in Iraq and told me with deep sincerity that she wasn't really very political. She just wanted Muslim folks in Iraq to come to know the love and grace of Jesus. I told her that this is exactly what I want. We consider together the ethos of our world and ask the question, are Muslim people any closer to understanding the gospel of peace and the God of love? And the answer was quite clear to us. We sat in a prayerful silence. Too often we just do what makes sense to us and ask God to bless it. In the Beatitudes, God tells us what God blesses: the poor, the peacemakers, the hungry, those who mourn, those who show mercy. So we should not ask God's blessing on a declaration that we will have no mercy on evildoers. We know all too well that we have a God who shows mercy on evildoers, for if he didn't, we'd all be in big trouble, and for that, this evildoer is very glad. Rather than do what makes sense to us and ask God's blessing, we do better to surround ourselves with those who God promises to bless, and then we need not ask God's blessing. It's just what God does. When I returned from Iraq, I was speaking everywhere, from mega churches to activist rallies to the United Nations. I've heard so many beautiful stories of courage, congregations that have caught the vision for God's borderless love and erected the Iraqi and Afghanistan flags alongside the US flag at their altars. Originally, I thought that I went to Iraq for the Iraqi people and for the kids in my neighborhood. But as I have traveled, I have come to see that I also went to Iraq for our friends and family members in the military. Over and over, soldiers have come to me with tears in their eyes, pouring out their inner conflicts as they feel the spiritual and national allegiances collide. Soldiers have come to the altar to ask for forgiveness for what they did in Iraq. One young soldier came forward for an altar call in which I invited people to disarm and lay their burdens on the altar. He said that he was one of the ships that fired the Tomahawk missiles into Baghdad while I was there, and now he was living with that. And we prayed and cried out to God. Another older soldier came up to me and said, I've been all over the world with the military. I was in Afghanistan, I was in Iraq. With tears in my eyes, he told me about his struggle with his identity, and he handed me his dog tags from around his neck. Over and over, we have soldiers visit our community and live with us. We have helped some of them leave the military. Others have returned missionally, leading Bible studies in the military like they were in a little Christian underground. Another friend still in the Air Force told me about Bible studies they were doing in the military, reading books by authors like Walter Wink and John Howard Yoder, prophets of Christian peacemaking. Pledging allegiance. Rebirth means that we have a new paradigm of us and them. Our central identity is no longer biological, and our central allegiance is no longer national. Our pronouns challenge. Our new us, as Jesus teaches, is the church, the people of God doing the will of the Father. Certainly, there are times when America is that, and there are times when America is not. When we hear that we were attacked, do we think we, the church, or we as Americans? What is our primary identity? When the Bush administration said that a way of life was being attacked, it was true, but it was not the gospel that was being attacked. It is no coincidence that what was attacked wasn't the World Council of Churches, but the symbols of the corporate global economy and the arms that would protect it. More than ever, we must be asking what will create a safer, more sustainable world. And I believe God has given us a vision for that, a vision that looks very differently from the dream of America. One soldier I met returned from Iraq deeply disturbed. He said, I just risked my life for the American dream, and I'm not even sure I believe in it anymore. And I'm pretty sure that the world cannot afford it. No wonder Jesus began to weep as he overlooked Jerusalem, crying out, If you had only known what would bring you peace. Luke 19:42. Over the past couple of years since I was in Iraq, the drums of war have died down, and the desperate cries of lonely survivors have ripped across the globe. And in these raw moments of pain, I have seen so many signs of hope that history will not again repeat itself with more precious bloodshed. Nearly every denomination in the World Council of Churches declared that the war in Iraq was not God's will and not in line with any Christian tradition, including just war theory. The Pope spoke out and sent a convoy to Baghdad while we were there. Evangelical theologians from all over the earth have written extensively about the war in Iraq and its alternatives, like my friend Reen Padilla in Argentina, author of War and Terror, A Latin Perspective. And this broad voice gives credibility to the speck of Christianity we see here in the U.S. after traveling internationally. I have been refreshed to see a global church with such integrity, a church which, for the most part, does not suffer the polarization and dualism of evangelicalism in the United States.